Hey, how we doing out there, guys? So, welcome back to the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. Kind of get back a little bit on track with kind of some of the intended content that I initially wanted for my podcast. Obviously, I'm going to continue to talk about the Russian operations in Ukraine. Just because obviously that's a big deal and definitely in line with the things that I'm talking about. But what we're going to talk about in this episode is the morality of providing aid to enemies or the morality of saving enemies. So I probably could have come up with a better title, I suppose, but that's not really my strong suit. So this episode, I don't intend to offer a ton of argument and evidence, and here's what I think the right answer is on everything. I kind of intend this to be a little bit more of a Socratic method kind of approach, i.e., I want to introduce the topic, kind of explain some things that I think about it, some thoughts or some things to consider, and then kind of hope that you guys, discuss it, whether in the comments or, even in your own lives, things I don't think that people always kind of talk about. So, what I'm talking about when I talk about the morality or the issue of giving aid to the enemy, especially in the modern realm, is a couple of like primary examples kind of come into mind. So, the most, I guess, obvious example of this is one that probably a lot of you are familiar with. And so there's an incident in 1943. It's kind of called the Franz Stigler Charlie Brown incident. So you guys have heard of it. It's when a very heavily damaged B-17 over Bremen, Germany, was encountered by a Bf-109 pilot, and the pilot, upon seeing multiple wounded crew members and the frantic nature of the crew attempting to kind of get themselves out of a jam when they were unable to keep up with and maintain formation. So the Bf-109 pilot himself ended up escorting this B-17 basically out of the flak belts so that he could escape. So it's kind of held up a lot of times as sort of an honor amongst combatants kind of incident in World War II. And I guess personally, I actually think that's completely incorrect. And this is kind of what I intend to discuss with that. So I kind of think I wish there was like a better single word for some of this, so I don't have to bounce around a lot with my thoughts on it. But I kind of in my brain, I kind of use a couple of terms, like the short-term honor versus long-term honor of certain things. So we could use kind of starting in World War II, for example, because obviously, like pilots became a very big thing prior to World War One, and then specifically within World War One. But parachutes didn't exist, so by and large, if you got shot down, you either died or you crashed and or died in World War One, and even kind of immediately after that. It wasn't until World War II where parachutes for pilots and or aircrew became very standard, very commonplace. And so there's kind of a lot of things that sort of go into this. So obviously, kind of using that specific example. So one thing I think gets lost in the individual honor of combatants is that, to use this specific example, so the pilot of the B-17, Charlie Brown, had flown multiple missions to include this mission. As they were heavily damaged, they took one of the crew members was decapitated by a cannon round, a flak round. The rest all survived. Some were, seriously wounded. But he actually completed his mission tour. So he flew additional missions, in B-17s before being rotated out. So what this actually means is that in what's considered an honorable act in letting this pilot and this plane escape, this German pilot in this example, this Luftwaffe pilot, actually let well-trained people that serve in a highly skilled position, or at least some of them serve in highly skilled positions, i.e. pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, let them return. They certainly were put back in additional airplanes because they flew additional missions, and they definitely killed additional German civilians after that. So in this case, I actually don't think there's any good argument for any morality in allowing the aircraft to escape and allowing the crew to escape. From a strictly military standpoint, the plane itself is still very much, in action. I don't know if the plane itself returned to action, but certainly it could have been parted out. Multiple crew members definitely returned to action. And then this kind of leads us, kind of into the natural genesis from that, which is to talk about, we could kind of flip this on its head. So Allied pilots, if they're dealing with shooting down German pilots, and there's obviously kind of the general rule was that if you shoot down an aircraft, if the pilot or the crew bails out, you don't shoot crew members that are in parachutes because they're kind of defenseless at the time. And again, that sounds like an honorable way to prosecute things, but let's kind of think of this in in realistic terms. So if you're an American air crew, and let's continue with the bombers because this is kind of a simple one. Let's say you're B-17 crew, you're dealing with being attacked by the day fighter force of the Luftwaffe, the Jagdgeschwader, the destroyer wings of the German Air Force, basically. And so you manage to shoot down an airplane. So the pilot bails out. So the machine itself is destroyed, which is a good thing. But now you have in the pilot, you have somebody who is very highly trained. Now, obviously, individuals may have been better or worse or more trained or less trained, but compared to other jobs, a pilot is a person of a very high skilled position. So high levels of training, particularly if it's someone with a lot of experience. And so as this person is floating back down defenseless, you don't shoot at them because that's the honorable thing to do. Well, you're over occupied Europe in all of these cases. So as soon as this pilot hits the ground, what happens? He gets returned right back to the Luftwaffe. They find him another plane because there's more than likely, somebody else got killed. But also a thing that we know about the German Luftwaffe in World War II is while they certainly didn't have the production output of the Allies, like nobody's like talking about that, they never really suffered from the shortage of planes that kind of gets made out. They suffered from shortage of fuel and equipment, and they suffered from experienced pilots, particularly in the latter stages of the war, because they never really settled on a good method of training. The Americans, you served a certain number of missions, then they rotated you back to the States and you became instructors and things like that. So while technically speaking, American pilots had less experience and may have, quote unquote, been less individually skilled than some of the very best of the German pilots, we had massively more pilots. So the average skill was certainly much higher. And then obviously we have a big quantitative advantage, a very big numerical advantage. So I think that's something to keep in mind, which is it actually, in this case, is it actually immoral then to shoot a pilot in a parachute? Right? It's not immoral to kill a pilot in the plane because that was very common as you're shooting at a fighter plane. There's not a lot of the fighter plane that is not the pilot. So very common to kill the pilot in the process. There's nothing immoral about that. There's nothing that's immoral about shooting planes while they are coming into land or while they're going for takeoff, which was very common practice when the Allies started encountering the Me-262 Schwalbe, the jet fighter. Very common to attack them on either takeoff or on landing when they're incredibly vulnerable. Very common to attack airfields and otherwise like barracks and things like that. So I sort of offer up that it's actually, not only is it not immoral or dishonorable, it actually makes complete sense. Because to use this example is, let's say we use Gunther Rahl, for example. So the third highest scoring Luftwaffe ace in World War II, credited with 275 aerial victories. I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff. I believe he said he was shot down. It was numerous times anyways. I don't want to say an exact number, but numerous times he was shot down. So every time he got shot down and then got back in another plane, he definitely caused additional casualties on the Allied side. So that's something to keep in account. Now, we can kind of sort of advance from that a little bit and kind of talk about other machines where this may be something to kind of take into account in other situations, because I think some of the situations are a little bit, kind of straightforward or very simple to think about. Some of them get a little bit sketchy. So let's take tanks, for example. So very famous incident, 1945 in March in Cologne, Germany. The famous instance of the Panther under the cathedral in Cologne being engaged by the M26 and completely destroyed after this tank had destroyed multiple other vehicles. So as we're talking about the Pershing versus the Panther kind of instance here, the particular vehicle, and this is a very great example because there's video of it. So the gunner fired 3 rounds into the tank. The first one had completely disabled it. The second one, definitely aided in that. And the third one lit it on fire completely and caused a severe burnout. And multiple crew members escaped. So it gets offered up that, you know, perhaps after wounding, after disabling a tank, one should not shoot at it. And so again, I just offer something to think about is that one, a tank crewman is a skilled person. You can't just put anybody in a tank on day one and have them be an effective crew member. So having being able to eliminate trained personnel as well as the vehicle itself is very important. So that's kind of something to think about as the crewmen may be clambering out of hatches and things like that. And it's sometimes people offer up that it's dishonorable to machine gun the crews as they are scrambling out. Whereas I would offer that not only is shooting at the crew a moral act and a perfectly reasonable, from a strictly economical standpoint, because there's absolutely nothing to stop them from getting out and running right back to the next vehicle and getting in that. But then of continuing to shoot at vehicles until they are completely on fire, completely destroyed. And this gets brought up a lot on the Eastern Front of World War II, talking about like the difference between quote unquote kills versus catastrophic kills. And so it was fairly commonplace on both sides to, if you had the opportunity, to shoot at a vehicle until it was on fire, because it was not uncommon to shoot a tank, have it be penetrated, potentially kill multiple crew members, maybe kill or wound the entire crew. And then with a fairly minimal amount of mechanical repair, the vehicle is back in action. So not only do we want to eliminate skilled members of the enemy force, like guys who operate, some sort of skilled position, we want to eliminate the vehicles as well. So I think that makes total sense. And, we can kind of, continue on with this. And again, I think some of those examples, I think the first one personally with the, talking about, the pilots and the air crew for me, is very straightforward. I think you can definitely start to go down the very tricky, slippery slope here. So then we could talk about things like, let's say, for example, you've seen this in Ukraine, in Russian ops in Ukraine. So helicopter gets shot down, but it's not completely destroyed. So there was a video, like a helmet cam video, that a Russian pilot had flying a Ka-52, Alligator, which is basically like a close air support and attack helicopter. And he gets shot down and basically forced down to the ground. And he essentially exits the vehicle and stuff like that. So while he's forced down to the ground, and let's just, imagine the scenario that the vehicle itself is out of commission and he has to get a ride somewhere else, basically. So another helicopter has to come down and pick him up. Is it or is it not immoral to fire on the vehicle and or the personnel? So I would say there's a pretty obvious argument to say, hey, if the vehicle is still potentially operational, to fire on that. But what about the crew? So it's technically it's an unarmed pilot standing next to a otherwise, wounded, slightly damaged helicopter waiting potentially on pickup. So is it immoral to then prosecute operations against the crew members of that? I don't know. Again, food for thought for you guys. Conversely, we can kind of take this, kind of the sort of two, the penultimate and the ultimate zenith of this would be, imagine we're a commando force, some form of raiding force. So a raid by nature means that there is some form of infiltration and assault, and then there is a planned exfiltration and retreat from that, i.e. we're not going to stay there. So imagine we do some sort of assault, and we manage to take prisoners or otherwise wound enemy personnel, but we know we are going to be picked up or we're going to fall back and in some way we're going to exit the area. So where does the morality of eliminating enemy personnel end if we are going to be pulling out of a particular location, whether we're behind the enemy lines or whether this is front line but it's an assault, but we know we're pulling back because it's a raid. So where does it end when it comes to that? I think it's an interesting question, and again I kind of view that as the penultimate question, i.e. the one below the ultimate question. And then I think this kind of leads you to the ultimate question, which is the taking of prisoners of war. So I think for the most part, people would agree that the idea of taking prisoners of war is a moral and otherwise like good act. And now I would say there's definitely a lot of reasons to sort of argue in favor of that. Kind of obvious ones would be you want to encourage an enemy to surrender by showing that they will receive good or at the very least appropriate treatment, i.e. if you surround enemy units, and then when they surrender, those units are treated fairly well, as you continue to surround other units or run into these things, in the future, you're probably going to have a high probability or a high number of those units that do surrender. And them surrendering means that, relatively speaking, you're going to suffer fewer casualties and have to expend less ordnance assaulting those positions. Whereas if you were just going to eliminate all troops, not allow any sort of prisoners of war, any sort of surrendering, then obviously there's no incentive for them to quit fighting. So while yes, that means they're going to incur a lot more casualties themselves, it also means that you're going to incur more casualties and have to spend more resources in the fighting. Conversely, with that, obviously, at some point, taking a lot of prisoners of war becomes a logistical burden on yourself. Again, we could go back and we could use the German example of World War II. So it is certainly true that the number of POWs that the German army took in 1941 on the Eastern Front, so fighting against the Soviets, was debilitating in some ways. So now, would they have been better off, not allowing that, or essentially just eliminating all of these? I don't know. It's kind of impossible to sort of, Monday morning quarterback that after the fact. But it remains that having that, that large of a number of, individuals in POW camps take up resources. And then guys who are familiar with World War II, again, just because it's kind of an easy example. So you know about a lot of the partisan activity and things like that, the behind the lines activity. Now, what a substantial amount or the majority of the partisan activities were surrounded Soviet units who basically the Germans just essentially never captured or never had the ability to capture. It was very common because some of these pockets were absolutely massive. The pocket around Kiev in 1941 was like 300,000 Russians, i.e., that is more total Russians than are even on the entirety of the border and within Ukraine, doing the operations currently. It's like twice as many people as America had in Iraq at the peak of the Iraqi campaign in the global war on terror. So it's a number that's basically beyond counting, for all intents and purposes. So again, I don't really offer that as a here's the way and here's exactly what's going on. I think it's, for me, you kind of run into a sliding scale. And I think it's something that's it's worth thinking about, because if you're like myself, as I've spent my entire life studying war, studying military, studying war theory and everything like that. And eventually you get past the point of the equipment, you get past the point of the maneuvering and this general versus this general and this campaign or whatever. And now you start to really have to get into some of the psychology of what's going on and some of the other thing that's going on. I mean, if one believes that war can be moral in any sort of sense, where's the line that one draws for morality versus immorality? And I think it's something that's it's very worthwhile to think about. One, I think it definitely makes you really kind of stand back and go, damn, are we really the good people that we said we were all the time? But also, it's very easy to look at, oneself or one's own country and find justifiable reasons for all the things that happened, while conversely condemning the other side when they were basically doing exactly the same thing all the time. So again, I just offer that up as something that I think is definitely worth thinking about. And I'd like to see you guys, in the comments or, in the messages, kind of offer your opinions on that stuff and just kind of see where your guys' heads are at, see what you guys think about that. But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.